Welcome guys, this is a quick avalanche safety briefing for sledders. First thing you should do in the morning before you go sledding or the night before is check the avalanche bulletin. It has a huge amount of really useful information. You should then apply this information to your evaluator. This is a decision-making tool that helps you tell which terrain is safe in what sort of conditions. Simple terrain is terrain that you can pretty much ride anytime. It's pretty flat, there's no exposure from above, there's no avalanche paths. It's terrain generally under 20 degrees. It can be a lot of fun to play in, but there's very little or no avalanche risk. On the other hand, challenging terrain is much steeper terrain. You only want to go into this terrain when there's a low or a moderate reading on the avalanche bulletin. This is very important. Challenging terrain can look like this, and then we have complex terrain. It's often in the alpine. There's often multiple avalanche paths. You should only attempt this terrain when it's the lowest risk on the bulletin. However, to understand when it's safe, you need to understand the avalanche problems. And the CA has done a good job of defining avalanche problems. The first problem is wind slab. You can tell there's going to be some wind slab problems because of the ripples in the snow that you can see. Can you see those ripples in the snow? That's a good indication of wind slab. And right here, this wind slab breaks off, causes an avalanche, and it's quite a bit of damage. Obviously, a sled rolling down on top of you, that kind of thing. Persistent slabs and deep slabs, on the other hand, they have very little visual clues on the surface that something's going to happen, but there's a weak layer and they just pull out, start to crack, and then you get caught in them. So that's persistent slabs and deep slabs. The other types of avalanches are storm slabs. Often storm slabs aren't that deep. You won't see that wind evidence. You can see this little layer plopping off. This is what we'd call a storm slab. A wet snow avalanche, on the other hand, just moves very slowly. Comes down like a bulldozer, but can certainly have a lot of destructive potential. But normally there's enough time to get out of the way. The last type of sort of serious avalanche problem is what we call a cornice avalanche, where you get to a ridge on a cornice, and if you get too close, it'll break away and you can have a big problem. It'll often start a larger avalanche lower down. And this is what a slough or a loose snow avalanche looks like. Here are a few avalanche never-dos. The first and probably the most important is never regroup underneath an avalanche path. There should only be ever one person exposed to an avalanche risk at any one time. So never regroup like this group underneath an avalanche path. You can see just coming up near the end, all these snowmobilers in the lower left of this picture, all scrambling to escape this oncoming avalanche. So never regroup underneath an avalanche path. It's not a good idea, and will often lead to trouble. The next point is similar to the first, but in the sense that you should never have more than one person exposed at a time. So don't have two or more people playing on a slope, because they might set off an avalanche on top of each other, like what happened in this scenario. Just as we turned around, there's a lot of sledding and skiing and weight on the slope. It's very, very dangerous, and just going to cause some problems. There's an avalanche back there in the picture. Yeah, and then you can see obviously they're going over to try and rescue their buried friend, the friend that they just buried themselves. And they're trying to dig him out, and there's a risk that he could have died in this situation. Pretty small little slope, but high consequence. Another important thing is to never face uphill in an avalanche path. face off to the side, face towards your escape route is the smart thing to do. So here are a bunch of avalanche things you should always do when you head into avalanche terrain. The first and most important thing is always ride with friends. A group of 3 or 4 is probably ideal. 1 or 2 is probably too little, and a big group of more than 4 or 5 is hard to communicate. So you need friends so they can dig you out. Second thing is you always need to check the avalanche bulletin each day. Check the conditions. That's super important. Will give you good data. And next, it's really important to always carry a shovel, a probe, and a transceiver. These are the basic tools, and they should be worn on your back, not inside the sled. The next thing is it's always really important to watch anybody moving in avalanche terrain. You need to do that from a safe distance so you can identify last seen points. That's really important. So what are some signs of instability? Probably one of the big ones is cracking. Just on this video here, there's some good examples of some cracking going on. The next one is if you observe any natural avalanches from the last 48 hours or even in the day that you're riding. Also, you're looking for results from sled cutting and from whoops. Some key terminology is this is a crown, you can see here. That's where an avalanche starts. This is cracking, that's important. And next is terrain trap. You can see the snow getting sort of stuck on that ledge. Terrain traps can also be cliffs. That's another good example of terrain trap. And this is the bed surface, this hard bed surface here, what we call the bed surface. So scenario 1 is just imagine you're watching someone and an avalanche starts and they get buried. So give them a warning if you can. They may not hear this, but just as you see the avalanche start, you should be yelling out into a radio, letting them know that something's happening. And then once it does start, you've got to watch. You've got to watch because we want to know where you last saw them so we can start our search at that point because that's where we'll start to look, and that saves time. The next step is we need to organize a search. It's really important. Assess, is it safe to help? How many people are missing? If so, get everybody to go to the search mode on their transceivers, and then we start assigning roles. Right away, we have some hasty searches that'll look for obvious visual clues. We have people assemble probes and shovels, and we assign a spotter to the slot. And next, we pull out our transceivers. So I'll show you how to use these transceivers once we get to the cabin tomorrow or on Sunday. The first probe strike should be where you had the lowest number in your transceiver. Probing should be perpendicular to the slope. The second probing should be about 1 foot or 20 or 30 centimeters away from the first probe. Probe down until you hit the ground. It feels kind of frozen or hard. And then keep probing in a spiral pattern till you find the person. That's really important. The 2 indications that you'll found somebody are a change of depth and the feel. It feels kind of soft and spongy rather than hard and icy. And probing should always be perpendicular or at right angles to the slope. So this angle is right. That's how you should be probing on steep slopes. And probing straight down should only be done on flat slopes, not steep slopes like this. Digging. Leave the probe in as long as possible. Start on the downhill side of the probe. Work as a team. Move the side initially to the side and then downhill. On steep slopes with a burial depth greater than a meter, go down the hill about 1 times the depth of the probe. So if it's 2 meters down, go back down the hill 2 meters. On flat slopes, go about 2 times the depth. So if it's 2 meters down, go about 4 meters back on flat slopes. Steep slopes and it's less than a meter, just pretty much dig right at the probe and dig your buddy out. That's important. On flat slopes, where it's less than a meter, you want to go back a little bit, but you don't need to go back too far. Digging near trees is tough. It's important to sort of dig from one side. Use the same principles as before, but you may need to come in from beside rather than from below. So that's important as well. This is a good example here. A 2-person digging team, one digger digs just below the probe, the other behind them, moving snow back. If you get a 3-person digging team, you can have 2 people up the front, 1 person digging behind. That works quite well. And if you have 4 people, you can have 2 at the front, 2 at the back, and digging towards the person works quite well. So scenario 2, imagine you're riding along and you're having a great time, and then you start to see some cracking. This is your sign to get out of that avalanche path as soon as you can. Try and ride the sled out of the avalanche path and just get the hell out of the path. But if you get caught, kick away from the sled and try and swim hard. You don't want to be with the sled mashed through an avalanche. It's pretty tough. So at some point then, you might go under the snow. What you want to do then is try and keep the snow from getting in your mouth and nose. You can use your hands or your arms to cover up your mouth and nose. If you're stuck under the surface and can't move, relax. Conserve your oxygen. If you hear a rescuer, yell back. And know that your buddies will dig you out. We're all a team and a family in the mountains. Hey guys, so there's a few things we'd like you to bring on Sunday. Shovel, probe, transceiver, lunch, a snow saw if you've got one, or a bush saw that's at least 30 centimeters long. See you up there. Thanks a lot.